So, in February 1939, a small-scale exhibition opened in Finsbury, London, showing Borough's high-ride percussion policy. The show exhibited and publicized a scheme for heavily protected underground shelter. Commissioned to Tecton's architects, assisted by Owe Arup. Far later, after the publication of Reichsverband der deutschen Industrie, Instruction pratique sur la défense passive, and an illustrated proposal for an air war in Le Corbusier Radiant City, the exhibition produced a wide impression on the British public, and also enlarged the debate on architecture of shelter in Great Britain. Soon after, the architectural press published an extended version of Tecton Arab's scheme for Finsbury titled Planet Harp that you see there. Martin Poley, John Allen, Kate Mallory, and Erwin Hotter had demonstrated how the scheme is a key experience about air raid passive defense, refuge architecture, and construction strategies for urban structure during World War II. This paper attempts to show that as part of Bertolt Lebedeking Design's activity for a larger program of social building and regeneration in the borough of Finsbury, the Shelters project not only reflects a deep engagement in reform architecture towards a modernist construction attitude to war, but is also a unique case study to understand mutation in architecture from peace to wartime, and from wartime to peace. In other words, paraphrasing Giorgio Agamben's study on present time, the conditional architecture between state of law and state of exception, between jus and justitium. Using the word of Walter Benjamin's, we could say that to be in a field of force of destructive torrents and explosion maybe represent the anxious experience of World War II. Okay. Well before the Abyssinian and the Spanish Civil War, literature and movies evoke the public's imaginary forces to predict the scenery of air raids in the next definitive war. How deeply this experience was internalized by the tiny, fragile human body can be understood not only by this cover of La Vie Future, that is the French version of The Thing to Come, a movie from H.G. Wells, The Shape of the Thing to Come of 1993, but also could be understood if we look at how this experience was still projected in the future by the 1966 movie Fantastic Voyage. It is the story of a miniaturized submarine injected in the veins of a scientist to repair a blood clot in his brain, the main troubles of which derive from the claustrophobia of a man in the crew who had lived the experience of being buried in a building destroyed by carpet bombardment. It is on the horizon of a high-rate destructive landscape that neo-modernists projected their new anti-elitist popular pop architecture, as the Smithson proposition for Golden Lane competition in 1951 was summarized. Urban citizens were not unprepared for the mass destruction operation of World War II. The First World War's limited air raid experience, regional conflicts, and propaganda slowly prepared them on time. Joss Steers' report for The Times, which then appeared in L'Humanité, 2 days after the air raid on Basque town, inspired Guernica. In fact, it has not to be forgotten that Guernica was painted in few weeks, before which Picasso had been working somewhat dispassionately for a couple of months on a mural commissioned by the Republican government for the Spanish pavilion on the Paris International Exhibition. So every country developed its own system of air raids percussion in relation with its philosophies and civil defense and war strategies. Sur le gratte-ciel, blindage définitive anti-torpille, c'est la letter F. Le dernier étage des redins peut avoir un blindage définitif ou ce blindage peut être constitué d'une extrême urgence par l'intermédiaire des sacs de sable, le point G, point I, H. La nappe de gaz s'étale sur tous les sols et elle est balayée par les courants d'air grâce au pilotis. De plus, la réserve d'eau des piscines permet d'abattre ces gaz pour les jets d'hydrant. Les habitants se réfugient aux étages supérieurs, pas d'abris souterrains. No underground shelters. Against all the Lieutenant Colonel Vaudrier's suggestion and every Le Corbusian evidence of presence of the 17th panel in the 1964 edition of the Radiant City, what is remembered as the British shelter controversy was deeply rooted in the ground. A querelle between surface and deep shelter, unique in the European context, dominated by centralistic and utilitarian solution. A debate in which architects seems to play a not autoreferential role, finding in the air raid percussion some strategies oriented to confirm their theories and projects. At the opposite of what happened for Le Corbusier in France, looking for specific solutions for a modern point of view at the problem of air raids, their propositions were used, not without ideological intent, to produce social and political critiques and participate in the more general reflection about the complexity and the contradiction of the modernization of the British society. In the architectural field, from the article of Maxwell to the book of the Architecture of Aggression, the British air raid percussions debate has been well studied and it is now incredibly well documented on a number of websites. This permits an understanding not only of how the querelle took up space in mass media, as the song that I put at the beginning of my presentation, but also how efficient government propaganda was in building the myth of a country under attack and its capability to maintain its fundamental cohesion and London's capability to function as an highly integrated metropolis. John Allen has well reconstructed in his main monograph on Bertolt Lubetkin the Tecton's plan for air raid percussion for Finsbury Borough. And a recent monograph on over Europe also showed the relevance for the Danish engineer. As is well known, Lubetkin and his group started their relation with the borough in 1935, hired by Kunila Katyal, an immigrant Indian doctor practicing in East London, who was at that time chairman of the Public Health Committee of the borough, and who was to become London's first not white mayor in 1938. Katyal, who had been deeply impressed by the Tecton's treatment of a tuberculosis clinic for Dr. Philip Hellman, asked to, in the following of this positive experience have promoted a large group of intervention for new civic squares, including social amenities and new housing schemes on slum-cleared sites. That made of Finsbury an exemplar program in modern reformation of dense urban districts before and after World War II. It is in this context that right after the Munich crisis, the chairman of Finsbury Air Raid Percussion Committee, appointed in response to an Home Office circular of 1935, charged Tecton to survey the district and submit comprehensive methods to be adopted for protection of the whole of the population in the event of war. In collaboration with the borough engineer, A.L. Downey, and O.V. Arup. So, in the days that saw Guernica arrive in London to support the Republican cause, this team started a project that was ready to be presented to the borough's citizens after only 4 months. In the light of this presentation, it is appropriate to focus on 3 aspects of the plan. First, the implementation of the urban survey technique to confront a specific wartime situation, a peculiar attitude of the war team towards not a small-term response to extraordinary events, but permanent investment in urban infrastructure. Third, the role and the methods and the strategies put into action to communicate the plan, created by the participation of Gordon Cullen as a freelance draftsman hired by Lubetkin at his first large occasion to develop his townscape style of the post-World War period. Now, urban survey. The high-rate percussion plan for Finsbury seems to be based on an emblematic subdivision of work by specialities. The comprehensive urban survey to determine suitable shelter location is assigned to the borough's technicians. The research into the effects of bombs and the most effective form of shelter to the architects with the assistance of Arup for all the engineering aspects and of Cullen for the communicational aspects. This collaborative approach, typical of Tecton, that had been possible because all the members had worked in previous projects. So, to measure what it means to work in a war perspective, or how architecture planning slides towards the state of exception, it could be useful to compare the plan with some of these projects. For example, it is possible to place the urban survey in comparison with the Mars Benthal Green exhibit in 1934, to which the Tecton groups participated, and find that the criteria look quite the same. They became more accurate and precise. It is possible to divide the 20 presentation panels that summarize the Finsbury survey in 4 parts. Night and day population, to establish numbers of those in passage at intervals through the 24-hour cycle to determine the required capacity of shelters, full information on existing building, to indicate the degree of existing projection or controversially the likely extent of debris, geological and topographical data, underground services, to plot possible shelters location as potential hazard. Oriented towards the more strict purpose to plot the shelter location and based on a street-by-street census, some of the layers in the communication panel of the Mars exhibition in 1934 that you are looking became accurate and detailed. The urban space is condensed into a logical network and becomes an operation support for the project. To analyze, at the second step, to analyze the change in Gordon's Cullen contribution, the Planet Harp scheme can be confronted with the panels of getting it across the layman. The cartoons that he prepared for the exhibition at the opening of Finsbury Health Center. We could start this confrontation by looking at a famous black and white photographs of the building. The picture is modified to make Health Center profile more sharp, like if it is a light machine, in opposition to the darkness of the slums in the back. This attitude and enlightenment becomes clearer if we confront this image with another collage. In it, the same picture of Health Center is inserted in its intended setting. And it is possible to see the proposed park in the rear of the foreground gardens, which would have linked the building across a nearby railway tunnel. The ET Center declares the borough process of slum clearing, a process opening the space which could be seen as an anticipation of a high-rate destruction. Here, it is interesting to examine the Cullen panels, point by point, modern building, orderly design, open planning, restful rooms, clearing servicing. Redraws of photos of the Health Center are opposed to existing building and situation to explain the practical comfort and rational values of the new building. In the intent to communicate and make understandable the scientific process of elaboration of the shelter plan proposition for Finsbury, Lubetkin asked Cullen to prepare other panels for the February 1939 exhibition. Large numbers of cartoons were reused in Planet Harp books to synthetically illustrate the text written by Tectons and communicate some technical plans and aspects. In continuity with health center panels, the didactic attitude of Callan's diagrams seems to communicate all the reassuring qualities that modern construction presents to work. Powerful imagery of the results of building fabric collapse due to highly explosive bombs produced by Callan do not remove danger, but send its solution not to an individual traditional domestic landscape, or to a shelter which people could use in their own homes, as proposed by Home Ministry. They dialogue with the light, progressive and fluid construction of collective, heavily protected shelter, and offer protection of civilian population rather than its mere accommodation. In this sense, the representation of a destruction scape at its double not only the safety and quiet gesture of the plastic human figures that lead the cutaway models of Tecton, but also in a horizon of community in which the collective value of living, of buildings during the war gives sense to design. What characterizes the proposition of the art plans of Finsbury is the attitude to suggest structures recycled in peacetime, not a small-term response to extraordinary events, but permanent investment in urban infrastructure. This position is based on the solution elaborated by Arup. The Danish engineer develops the concept of danger volume, a function of the proximity of sites of the bomb and the amount or type of protection. In this way, it developed a means of measuring scientifically the comparative protective value of different sorts of shelters. This index, used in conjunction with conventional estimating, could thus provide a veritable index of safety and cost, or comparative prediction of casualties against outlay. Following some suggestions about the use of car tunnels and shelters, Arup arrived to elaborate spiral ramped shelters designed to convert in car parking use in peacetime, as convenient as they are big in relation to the population they have to serve. They became the deepest shelter solution that after the Finsbury proposal covered the pages of the national and local press, and Lubetki also presented on television. Policy based on the dispersal theory, which foresaw basement reinforcement and large use of light wall metal shells issued by the Home Office to individual householders to install in their gardens, named for the Lord Privy Seal and Prime Minister's Chamberlain Minister responsible of ARP strategy, Sir John Anderson shelters. Sustained by lefty groups and parties, the Tecton schemes assume the character of a critique to the improvisation and individual-oriented policy of the Tories, but is also politically conflictual. A model of a spiral ramped shelter was exhibited in a public march in support to the deep shelter policy. Arup was also critical towards the government ARP strategy, but he was disappointed by the ideological use of his project. If not by the redrawing of and reproduction of his project, by the report, What is Wrong with the Official Shelter Policy, produced by a small group in political opposition to government. It is possible to perceive the desire of the Danish engineer not to be melted at the level of political confrontation by the fact that Arup, who had presented an independent technical investigation at the moment of the Finsbury report, refused to be co-author of the Planet Art book and published his own shelter book titled Design, Cost, Construction, and Relative Safety of Trench, Surface, Bomb-Proof, and Other Air Raid Shelter. In April 1939, the Home Office rejected Finsbury's proposal for a deep shelter. In March, the Secretary of Winston Churchill had sent a famous letter to Tecton to affirm Churchill's unfavorable impression of Planet Art book, and his idea that the wide circulation of such a book would not be helpful at the present juncture. After receiving the Home Office criticism, Finsbury Council asked Tecton for a revised proposal for one of the sites, Busasco Street, where one housing project was foreseen. Without any Home Office subsidy, An interesting attempt was made by arranging a private company to finance the construction of shelter as future car parks, which the borough would then acquire leasehold. Tecton and Arup also designed less cost-effective surface and shallow shelter to be built in open square and designed for peacetime use as a shopping shelter. Lübeck and Arup reached with different strategies and practices to the rejection of the plan by the Home Office. After the official rejection, Lübeck quit the debate. Tecton proceeded with the provision of smaller shelter and various type, and with the construction of an underground control center beneath the town hall of Finsbury until June 1940. After that time, at Tecton's recommendation, Arup was commissioned to complete the defense program for the Finsbury population. Faced with the official rejection, Arup continued in dialogue with the Home Office and its experts, insisting on the necessity of a more scientific approach to air raid provision policy. At the same time, Arup had been extremely busy designing shelters for companies, local authorities, and private citizens, including adaptation of the basement of his office for 77 staffs and 323 citizens. In October 1940, he published a further report to Finsbury Borough Council, London's Shelter Problem, and in 1941, Safe Housing in Wartime. Later, he was involved in the design of marine and military engineering projects throughout the duration of the war. When Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, one branch of the London Underground had been adapted for shelter use. London transport officials denied entry to anyone unable to prove an intention to travel in August. But in September, with the beginning of the London Blitz, Londoners' popular preference for deep shelters protection seemed to fulfill Tecton's prediction. On the 8th of September, Churchill informed Anderson that he wished to see widespread utilization of the tubes, and after 3 weeks of intense bombing and almost 6,000 Londoners killed, Anderson was replaced by Herman Morrison. They still encouraged people to take quite simple measures to create a refuge room within their home, thanks to Morrison's shelter, a kind of metal frame table underneath which a person was protected by steel mesh, strong enough to protect them against falling rubble and most damage apart from a direct heat. The government had miscalculated the effects of night bombing, the need for sleeping in public shelter, and the logistic of organizing large civilian groups. They turned for advice on deep shelter to Dr. Anderson, who was a joint of consulting engineer of the London Passenger Transport Board, and accepted his recommendation to extend tunneling for such purpose within the existing tube system. In January 1941, 8 new shelters were built. The first opened at the end of November, another 7 not until July 1944. In addition, by the end of 1940, 79 tube stations were adapted for shelter. The government policy seems to show a sense of continuity. The dispersal theory is grounded on the idea of externalization of cost towards the individual and the families. The Anderson and Morrison shelter were furnished for only a few pounds, suggesting the general attitude was not to get involved in onerous public investment or passive defense. This is also associated with a socio-political vision that supports a familiar individualistic perspective that will inform, for example, the dispersed and anti-urban, anti-atomic precaution in America during the Cold War. Sir Anderson vigorously opposed to the construction of deep shelters on the ground of cost. He and many authorities also add that a deep shelter mentality would so sap civic morale that citizens will never emerge to carry on their duties. When Anderson's strategy showed all its inefficacy, the tube solution, practiced during the small air raids of the First World War, was assumed like a natural consequence. Once more, all the contradiction, all the cost of tension are externalized over individuals and can also be used later to build the rhetoric of heroic resistance to extreme condition of danger. Technon and Arup design a vision quite original in the scenery of modern replies to air raids and war attack on urban space. If the image of slum clearing in Finsbury at the health center confirms their enlightening spirit, their proposal looks radically urban and deep collective in front of the dispersal and individualistic strategy settled out by government. For example, one of the points in contrast with Home Office is that the scheme for Finsbury foresaw protection not only for the residents, but for all the daily workers' population. Urban, in front of the dissolution of the city, as form of civil defense proposed as by Le Corbusier in Sur les Quatre Beaux, or such as Alzheimer in his scheme for Chicago and other American cities at the beginning of the 40s. To have a sort of conclusion, I propose a verification at the level of artistic reflection. The most celebrated representation of the London Blitz are the unremoved drawings of tube and shelter figures. What is interesting is that if we observe Moore's representation, and that of other artists, as for example the photographs of Bill Brandt that we have seen before, it is possible to understand the evolution of the situation in the tube. We could assist at a process of adaptation, a modification in relation to the use. In the first series, it could be noticed that people are not well settled and manage to pass the night sleeping sitting up or just covered with blankets. There are no beds or more complex accommodation. Some figures take a snack. At times, it seems as though Moore is typing or Moore is trying to draw heads in the style of Picasso, who he had visited in Paris not long before the war, where he had seen Guernica in progress. Stations were warm, and there was a strong sense of companion. Despite the discomfort and the total lack of privacy, people learned to adapt and found they were able to get some sleep, certainly more than if they had stayed in the surface shelter of Anderson. The tube did not scare. On the contrary, it became an alternative tonic world without fear, a sleepy collective. Sleep, compassion, more than ancient tragedy are the dominant sensation. This contrast is well comprehensive in Moore's drawing, where the tube scene are juxtaposed with destroyed landscape of the above. Contrast of peaceful, normal, with sudden devastation above, as a note of the artist say. During the post-war period, Moore would fight against the impression that his drawing had been produced as part of propaganda effort, since it was known that the War Artists Association committee that had commissioned part of his drawing was run by the Ministers of Information and Home Security. Moore often said that the reason he gave up doing the Shelton drawing was because the authorities tidied up the tube station, and he had no longer found them so interesting. Maybe this is not the true, or the only reason. But it was becoming stale, making too many versions of the same subject. The RIBA archive conserved luminous photographs of a tube, a new extension, prepared by the government after the first weeks of London's Blitz. The tube as shelters presents all the conditions of enduring, endure, and those who are there, who live there, essentially needs comfort. If we confront this condition with the image of Arup model of 1939 spirals rampant shelter, figurines stand up or they are seated on benches. It seems that they should not stay in that situation for a long time. They leave architecture in a state of exemption, an architecture that, at first sight, seems incapable to design the present, but only the waiting between a before and an after, waiting to escape in the present or of the before, or in the present of the after. Have we to conclude that was it is impossible to think an architecture during the war? Maybe not. Europe was to become conscious that living the shelter presented needs and specific comfort. At the end of his book of 1941, Safe Housing in Wartime, appears a very ugly sketch that shows all the distance of this drawer from the Gordon Gallant capabilities and all the distances from the effort to share the experience of more study for a shelter sheen. In a hostel, a small group of men seemed to be sleeping in a comfortable bunk beds. Unfortunately, the scene seems to unconsciously to something less comfortable, a landscape about which Paul Jascott has taught a lot to us this morning.